Aimee lived the kind of life most people only saw in movies or on Instagram. Her days began late, often well past noon, as she stretched out on her plush king-size bed, dressed in silk nightgowns, and scrolled endlessly on her brand-new iPhone 16 Pro Max. The entire mansion she lived in radiated wealth, imported Persian rugs, gold-plated mirrors, high ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows. She didn't work, didn't lift a finger, and didn't feel the need to. Her idea of productivity was double-tapping photos of other rich housewives showing off their luxury vacations and shopping hauls. When she saw an influencer flaunting a new Hermes Birkin bag with the caption, "Another shopping spree in Paris, because why not?" she sighed dramatically and said to herself, "It's been almost 2 months since my last trip. I'm overdue for Dubai." Despite having house staff who catered to her every whim, Aimee treated them with indifference and entitlement. Her maid, Felicia, would knock softly each morning to announce that breakfast was ready, only for Aimee to demand it be brought to her bed. And when things weren't exactly to her liking, like when her tea wasn't hot enough, she'd lash out without hesitation. She didn't care about feelings or effort. To her, perfection was a bare minimum standard, and everyone around her was simply there to serve her needs. She constantly complained about the help, blaming them for her slightest inconveniences, and even told her husband, Abu, that he needed to replace them. In her world, nothing was ever good enough unless it sparkled, was imported, or had a designer label attached to it. Her husband, Abu, a young and successful businessman who had made his fortune in real estate and oil ventures, had hoped that marriage would mature in Medina. He believed that with love, patience, and encouragement, she would eventually find something meaningful to do. He set her up with multiple businesses, a salon, a fashion line, even a supermarket. But she scoffed at the very idea of work. "God forbid I sit in a shop like a common woman," she'd say with disgust. Her entire identity revolved around spending money, posting on social media, and living in luxury without ever having to contribute. Abu grew increasingly frustrated, watching the woman he loved waste her life on empty pleasures, but every attempt to guide her toward responsibility was met with laughter or eye rolls. Aimee saw herself as a queen, born to be pampered and admired, not someone meant to hustle or struggle. The day everything changed started like any other for Ahmad. She slept in, wrapped in her silk sheets, with no concern for the world around her. The house bustled quietly, staff moving in and out of rooms, preparing her breakfast, attending to the usual chores while she remained in bed scrolling through social media. But everything came to a crashing halt when Felicia, her maid, entered the room with a shaky voice and uncertain eyes. "Madam," she began hesitantly, "there's news. Abu had an accident." Aimee laughed it off at first, dismissing it as nonsense, until a phone call from an unknown number shattered her world. The voice on the other end, calm and professional, delivered the blow with no emotion. Her husband, Abu, had died in a fatal car crash on his way back from Lagos. The phone slipped from her hand, and a scream tore from her throat. Her perfect life had just been ripped apart. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and grief. Visitors filled the house, family, friends, business associates, all offering their condolences, but none able to ease the growing panic inside her. On the 4th day, reality hit harder. A call from the hospital reminded her that the medical and mortuary bills needed to be paid 3.5 million naira. The maid froze. She had money in her account, but it was meant for an online shopping spree. Against her will, she used it to cover the bills. One problem led to another. The staff came asking for their salaries, which Abu had promised to pay after his trip. Aimee was stunned. She had never been involved in anything related to money management or salaries. Abu handled everything, and she had never bothered to ask. Desperate, she searched his safe for cash or cards, but found nothing. She went to the bank hoping to access his funds, but was told that his accounts were frozen due to a massive unpaid loan. The shock deepened. Abu had never mentioned any debt. The bank representatives looked at her with pity, but there was nothing they could do. Just when she thought things couldn't get worse, they did. Another visit from the bank revealed that the mansion she lived in had been used as collateral for the loan, and since the debt wasn't paid, the bank was reclaiming the property. Imaid had 24 hours to vacate. For the first time in her life, she was truly helpless. She fainted on the spot and woke up on the living room couch surrounded by the very staff who once served her without question. But now, one by one, they packed their things and left Felicia, the cook, the nanny, even the driver. They had families to care for and couldn't stay. By nightfall, the mansion was empty. Imaid sat alone with her toddler son in the cold silence of a house that was no longer hers. Her phone was silent too. The so-called friends who once partied and shopped with her ignored her calls. The wealth, the help, the lifestyle, it had all disappeared. And for the first time, Imaid realized she had nothing left but the harsh truth: she was on her own. With nowhere else to turn, Imaid packed what little she had left, some designer clothes, jewelry, and the last bit of cash, and called a taxi to take her and her son to her mother's modest bungalow on the outskirts of Abuja. When her mother opened the door and saw Imaid standing there dressed in fine clothes but looking completely broken, she was speechless. Imaid collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Her mother held her tightly, offering no words, only comfort. That night, Imaid lay awake on a thin mattress on the floor, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The silence was deafening. She wasn't in her luxurious mansion anymore. The maids were gone, the chef wasn't preparing gourmet meals, and no one was bringing her tea in bed. This was real life, and she was terrified. The next morning, she was jolted out of bed by a loud knock on the door. Her mother stood there holding a broom and mop. "This is not your papa's mansion," she said sternly. "You will sweep this house, bathe your child, and find something to do with your life." Imaid froze. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, but she had no choice. She picked up the broom and began to clean. Every task felt foreign and exhausting. Sweeping the floor took twice as long as it should have. Bathing her son was a clumsy ordeal. Her hands, once reserved for holding shopping bags and posing for selfies, were now blistered from scrubbing and cooking. Mealtimes were no longer champagne brunches or imported delicacies. She sat with her mother eating simple meals like iba and okra soup, barely able to swallow it first. Her pride had been stripped away, and for the first time in her life, she had to rely on herself. One evening, she sighed at the dinner table and said, "Mother, I don't know what to do. I have no money." Her mother calmly replied, "But you have clothes, handbags, jewelry." Jewelry? Things that could feed you and your child for months." Imaid stared at her in disbelief. The idea of selling her designer pieces felt like losing your last link to the life she once knew. But as she looked over at her son sleeping on the couch, she knew she had to let go of the past. The next morning, she contacted a reseller and sold over 80% of her luxury items. The money she received was a fraction of what they had cost, but it was enough to start over. Determined to rebuild, Imaid began researching small businesses she could start with her limited funds. After much thought, she decided to open a modest grocery and foodstuff shop. With her mother's help, she found a small space near a busy market, stocked it with essentials, bags of rice, beans, vegetables, and cooking oil, and opened her doors. On her first day, her hands shook as she made her first sale. It felt strange, even humiliating to be on the other side of the counter, but slowly, day by day, she adapted. The once pampered housewife was now waking up before dawn, budgeting money, dealing with customers, and managing inventory. Her back ached and her nails chipped, but there was a quiet pride building in her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for someone to save her, she was saving herself. Running a small shop was nothing like the life Imid used to live, but it slowly became her new reality. Each morning, she woke up before the sun, tied her hair back, and headed to the market to restock goods. She no longer had maids to do things for her. She was the one lifting heavy bags of rice, haggling with suppliers, and carrying items on her head when needed. The heat, the sweat, the long hours, it was grueling, but it was hers. Day by day, she got better at it. She learned how to deal with difficult customers, how to calculate profits and losses, how to manage her inventory without waste. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was honest work. Her fingers were no longer adorned with rings, but calloused from labor. And yet, with every passing day, she felt a little stronger, a little more capable. The woman who once couldn't even warm her own tea was now running her own business, providing for her son, and surviving it. 2 months into her new life, Imid had transformed completely. Her mornings were filled with purpose, and her nights were spent budgeting, planning, and resting from the exhaustion of the day's work. She had learned how to live without extravagance, how to cook with the basics, how to fix things on her own, and how to find peace in simplicity. She was no longer the same woman who believed the world owed her comfort. She had learned that comfort meant nothing without the ability to earn and protect it. With the small profits she made from her shop, she began saving little by little. Her mother helped her keep track of everything, teaching her how to plan ahead, think wisely, and prepare for the unexpected. In time, Imid had saved enough to do something she once thought was impossible: arrange a proper burial ceremony for her late husband. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was respectful, heartfelt, and funded entirely by her own hard work. On the day of the ceremony, the small cemetery was filled with familiar faces, former friends, relatives, and even some of the household staff who once worked for her. Imid stood there in a simple but neat outfit, her son by her side, looking every bit like a woman who had lived through the fire and come out stronger. As the crowd gathered and the moment came to open the coffin, a loud scream suddenly erupted from someone in the back. Everyone turned, confused, and then gasped in shock. Walking toward them, alive and unhurt, was Abu. Imid's heart stopped, her vision blurred, the world spun, and before anyone could react, she collapsed to the ground. When she came to, her eyes met the very man she had mourned, cried for, and suffered over. The man she had buried in her heart was now standing in front of her, alive. She didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run. All she could say over and over was one question: how? Imid stood frozen, her heart pounding as Abu stepped closer. The man she thought was dead, the one whose funeral she had planned with her bare hands, was standing right in front of her, alive, breathing, and unapologetically real. She wanted to believe it was a dream or maybe some cruel trick. "Stay away from me," she shouted, backing away. "You're dead. I buried you." The crowd around them gasped in confusion, unsure whether to cry, scream, or run. Some whispered, wondering if it was a ghost, but Abu remained calm. He reached out gently, trying to steady her. "Imid, I'm not dead," he said softly. "Let's go somewhere private and talk." But she shook her head, her voice shaking. "No, you're going to explain everything right here. I suffered in public, so you'll speak in public, so you'll speak in public." With all eyes on him, Abu took a deep breath. "I faked my death," he said bluntly. Gasps filled the air again. Imid blinked, unable to process what she was hearing. "You what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why?" Abu looked her in the eye. "Because nothing else worked. I begged you, Imid. I tried to help you become responsible. I gave you every opportunity to grow, to build something of your own, but you didn't care." You spent millions without thinking, refused every business I set up for you, and believed that life would always be easy. His voice wasn't angry, it was tired, broken. I had to do something drastic before it was too late. I had to show you what it meant to stand on your own. And I knew that if I warned you or told you it was just a lesson, you wouldn't take it seriously. Imade's body trembled with rage and disbelief. You let me suffer. You let me believe I was alone. You let your own son go through that with me. To even understand what I went through, her voice cracked as tears filled her eyes. Abu's expression softened. I know. I saw it all. I never really left. I had people keeping an eye on you. Every step you took, I watched. And I saw something I'd never seen before you fighting, working, growing. You became the woman I always knew you could be. Imade turned away, overwhelmed with emotion. She had spent weeks battling heartbreak, poverty, and humiliation only to find out it was all part of a plan. And yet, deep down, a painful truth settled in her chest. She had needed that lesson. For the first time, she saw who she used to be, a spoiled, ungrateful woman who expected life to hand her everything. She turned back to him slowly, tears still falling. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said honestly. Abu nodded, stepping closer. Take all the time you need. Just know I never stopped loving you. She looked into his eyes and whispered, Neither did I. A month after the shocking reunion, Imade and Abu began rebuilding their life this time with a new understanding. Abu kept his promise and opened one of the largest shopping malls in the city under Imade's name, but unlike the past, she didn't treat it like a toy. She showed up early, oversaw the hiring process, managed the books, and made sure every Naira was accounted for. The same woman who once scoffed at the idea of sitting in a shop now proudly ran an empire with grace and accountability. She still wore nice clothes, but she no longer cared about flaunting them. Her focus was on growth, sustainability, and providing for her son. The transformation was not just external, it was deep and genuine. Abu watched her with admiration, knowing that the woman beside him now was not the same Imade he had married. She had matured into someone he could truly build with. Imade didn't forget what she went through. Sometimes when she walked past the grocery stall where she once sold Garian vegetables, she would pause and smile, not out of shame, but pride. That small shop had saved her. It had taught her how to survive, how to value effort, and how to rebuild from nothing to none. She now used her story to mentor young women in her community, encouraging them not to depend solely on their partners for security, but to find purpose and build something of their own. Her relationship with her mother deepened too, no longer filled with entitlement or rebellion, but with respect. And her bond with her son grew stronger than ever. She had seen what it meant to have everything taken away, and she was determined to never let herself or her child experience that kind of vulnerability again. This story may sound like a dramatic tale, but the message behind it is real and powerful. Life can change in the blink of an eye. Money, status, comfort, none of it is guaranteed. Too often, we take luxury for granted and forget that behind every soft life, someone is working hard. Whether you're a wife, a husband, or a young person just starting out, this story is a reminder that self-reliance is not just admirable, it's necessary. Being comfortable isn't the problem. Being blind to reality is. Imade's journey from entitled housewife to empowered businesswoman is a lesson in humility, responsibility, and growth. We never truly know our strength until being strong is the only option we have. So if you're reading this or watching her story, ask yourself, if everything were taken from me today, what skills, mindset, or resilience would I have to fall back on? The truth is, the soft life is only sweet when you've earned the strength to sustain it. Life after Abu's return wasn't simple for Imade. Though the public reunion had ended in cheers privately, she was torn between lingering resentment and reluctant understanding. In the days that followed, news of Abu's resurrection spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with opinions. Some called Abu a genius, others branded him cruel and manipulative. And through it all, Imade had to walk with her head held high, answering questions with grace while masking the emotional chaos inside her. Old friends who had once ignored her during her downfall now reached out again, praising her transformation and acting as if they had never disappeared. She received invitations to high society events and interviews from media outlets wanting her story. But this time, Imade wasn't chasing validation. She declined most of them politely. For the first time, she wasn't seeking approval, she was seeking peace. At night, when the world quieted down and she was alone, the pain still lingered. She would lie awake, thinking about all the nights she cried herself to sleep, the hunger, the fear, the shame. Her mind often wandered back to the moments when her child looked to her for answers she didn't have, when she had to smile through the sting of failure just to keep going. And yet, she couldn't deny that she had changed. What hurt the most wasn't just the suffering, it was the fact that Abu had watched from the shadows and let it happen. But as much as she wanted to stay angry, she knew he was right. If he hadn't done what he did, she might still be the same lazy, ungrateful woman who thought hard work was beneath her. The worst part of growing up is realizing that growth rarely happens without discomfort, and sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who challenge us hardest. So slowly, Imade began to release the bitterness, not for Abu, but for herself. She started journaling her journey not for others, but as a way to heal. She wrote about the arrogance she once wore like a crown, the pain of losing everything, and the strength she found buried inside her. She even joined a women's empowerment group in the city, not as a speaker, but as a learner. Surrounded by women from all walks of life, she listened to stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. In their voices, she saw pieces of her own. And one evening during a group session, she finally spoke. "I used to think money protected me from the world. But life humbled me, and ungrateful it did." The room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. That night, she walked home lighter. She hugged Abu, not because she had fully forgiven him, but because she was learning how we learn how. And forgiveness, she realized, isn't a grand gesture, it's a process. A choice she would make one day at a time.